do so much of theory, but those people who actually have to take decisions regarding fiscal policy, what are the difficulties that they face? Those set of papers really help us understand that, but well, that's okay. Yeah. Okay, so can we start 3 and 3, 6 and 3, 9 and 1, 10? So there are 10 of you who are interested in this course, I hope. Okay.
Sir, 12, I think.
But I can see only.
No, if you see in the participants list, it shows 13 people. So excluding you, there will be 12.
Okay. Yeah. Correct. Okay, no problem. So great. Okay, so let's go to. Okay, is my slide visible?
Yes, sir, it's visible.
Excellent. What is happening? All right. So we had gone through this, saying that we were having a little discussion on whether state government expenditure and local government expenditures should be added on when we are thinking of stabilization policy, when we are thinking in the context of stabilization policy. Now, I gave you an answer which veered a little more towards only the central government expenditure should be considered. Why? Because stabilization is the responsibility of the central government. So, if for the time being you go along with this argument, there is no necessity that you should, but suppose you do, then this opens up the difficulty that state governments and local governments may undo what the central government is doing, right? So if we only look at central government expenditures and not look at state and local government expenditures, then this opens up the possibility that the central government may be contracting, okay, its expenditures, but the state and local governments are expanding them. So then there is a huge problem as to what is happening on the net. So how much is stabilization being from the fiscal side being useful, etc., etc. I think these kinds of arguments are a little hasty, because in normal circumstances, the extent to which state governments can borrow is hugely controlled by the central governments. This is a very hot topic in federal finance, but all over the world, there are huge limits on the borrowings of state governments. Now, and of course, local governments as well. So the possibility that states and local governments put together can possibly undo what the center is doing is not really credible, because the center does have overriding powers, and it can see to it that the states also control their expenditures when needed. Okay, so what are the institutions that govern how much state governments can borrow in our country? Does anybody know? Who decides how much government of Tamil Nadu or Maharashtra can borrow?
Sir, RBI decides on the capping, and it is almost near 20% of the state's GDP.
No. So RBI and Niti Aayog together do this.
Yes.
Okay, and
sir, isn't there a restriction on external borrowing by the state government? So central government in a way allows that based on a certain fulfillment of policies, because I read a news article about it recently.
Yeah. See, the amount that they can borrow from abroad, like, World Bank can have a project somewhere where they give directly to the state government or Asian Development Bank, etc., etc. These are very closely monitored, right? And there are sovereign guarantees on it. So there are lots of, and such borrowings happen over a long period of time, right? In fact, it takes a long time for a project to actually pass through, then get funding from World Bank or Asian Development Bank and things like that. So over here, and they have mostly to do with capital expenditure. Here, remember, when we are talking about government cutting expenditure, though in macro we do not say what expenditure is cut, but it is very difficult for governments to cut capital expenditures because then projects won't be completed. Okay, capital expenditures have a life of their own. You just cannot cut back capital expenditures just like that. Okay, so then a dam won't be built, a road won't be laid. So that there are issues here. So mostly we basically talk about current expenditures being cut back. We will get into this in a little more detail as we go ahead, but I just want to point this out that there is a good case that it is only central government expenditures that should be considered for measuring the stance of policy. Okay. Why? Because center is the overriding power, and they actually all over the world actually can prevent states from having runaway loans. And the main difficulty in federal finance is that the government can borrow because it has the right to print money, right? The central government. State governments don't have the right to print money, right? So then when state governments borrow, they always borrow against their tax revenues, future tax revenues. Okay, and very, very few countries have something akin to a bankruptcy code when it comes to subnational debt. And this is a very hot topic in federal finance, that what happens if states misbehave. Okay. So let's not go there. That's an interesting issue, but that's a different thing altogether. It's not very germane to what we are going to discuss. So all things considered, with the both hands, kind of one hand and the other, having weighed things, let us come to a reasonable conjecture that it is central government expenditure that is going to be most useful when we are thinking about fiscal policy. Okay. I'm not saying you should buy into my arguments completely, but we will have occasion to talk about this again, but as of now. And the reason why I'm saying as of now is because this is the graph that I have. Okay. So I have not updated this for many years. So this is the current and capital expenditures of the central government to GDP ratio. Okay, you can see it's around 20% now. It has come down a little bit. It has again gone up again in the later years. Okay, now the size of the government is not trivial, right? It's around, if you then add state government expenditures, it goes to around 25-26%. Okay, maybe a little more. Okay, so a quarter of the GDP is the ratio is around 25% of GDP. So that's a very, very large number. Now notice that in the initial years you see an upward trend, right? Okay, and in the later years you see it stabilizing. Now, why is this graph important? This graph is important because, think about it, right up to 1986, let us say, that you had an upward trend in the government expenditures to GDP ratio. Okay. Now, you will notice that there is this is going to create a problem. Why? Because for dealing with um, stabilization, we need the political system to give us a expenditure to GDP ratio that everybody agrees on and does not make drastic changes in. Remember, stabilization involves small increases in government expenditure. Stabilization policies never ever involve large increases in government expenditures. Okay, why? Precisely because the political system gives you a consensus, hopefully, on what the G to Y ratio should be. Now, if a government comes along and says that I'm going to increase this GDP, this ratio by a huge amount, because I'm going to have a very large dose of expenditures because we are in a recession, that is not on, because that breaks the consensus on what a long-term G to Y ratio is agreed upon. In the same way on the other side, right? So if there is a huge inflation, that is actual output is far greater than potential output, then nobody can argue that I'm going to cut the ratio by 5%. Because then, if you are saying that I'm having a political consensus of around 20, 21, 22%, and stabilization should either add 1% or reduce 1% or 2, whatever it is, if very large changes in the G to Y ratio start happening, then there is a huge problem. Okay, that is very clearly politics is not working in such a way that gives you a consensus on the G to Y ratio, government expenditure to output ratio. Now you can in fact think about the efficacy or the utility of politics as generating this G to Y ratio. Okay, without a stable consensus on this G to Y ratio, stabilization as we understand it is not possible. Do you agree with this statement?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, because you can think of 1991 as a break of that consensus. Everybody wanted everything to be done by the government. So, you were planning to become a Soviet-styled economy in the long run. Okay. But Narasimha Rao came around and said that no, that is not happening because that is not feasible. Okay, and therefore he dramatically cut the lists of items on which the government would spend and encourage the private sector to come in, this, that, and the other. So that kind of a story you will be able to cull out from your studies on the Indian economy. But the political question that is relevant for macro stabilization is, do we have a consensus on the G to Y ratio? If that consensus does not exist, you can do stabilization till the cows come home, nothing is going to happen. Your economy is going to remain very, very volatile in the absence of a consensus of this ratio. And this consensus is going to consist of what? Number one, it is going to consist of amounts. That is fine. But it is also going to consist of items. Okay, and the left and the right are never going to agree on the list of items and on the list of amounts. Okay, so a general consensus at the centrist level. So we should not fight too much on the list of items. Should the government run an airline? It has taken a long time, but now there seems to be a political consensus that no. Okay. Is there a credible list of activities from which the government should withdraw? Now, this is the context in which this whole story becomes credible. Because remember, if you have central government enterprises, okay, then it is very difficult to argue that their expenditure should not be a part of capital expenditures. Their expenditure should not be a part of government expenditures. It's a very gray area. Okay, for railways and the Atomic Commission, you absolutely cannot argue, right? Because they are departmental undertakings. But then you will say, no, but the expenditures made by the petroleum PSUs or any other large PSUs that you can think of, why should they be a part of government expenditure? Because they are listed on the stock exchange, so there are other things involved there. But if you ask the question, does the government have the power to increase the expenditure of these companies unilaterally? If the answer is yes, then of course they should be considered. So what should be considered as capital expenditures of the government is a dicey issue. Okay, and a lot can be said on either side, but for the time being, we say central government expenditures as told to us by the budget. Okay, any questions here before we go ahead? Okay, we can go ahead. Right. Now, before we get into the nitty-gritty of the subject, I just want to take a small detour. And so our discussion has led to the following kind of, all macroeconomics tells you that keep M fairly smooth, that is money supply fairly smooth, due to the unpredictability of it. Now, what do we mean by smooth? That is predictable. Okay, and now more recently, you want to keep interest rates predictable, right? Smooth meaning predictable. So in the more modern context, with the LM curve having completely moved out of macroeconomics, okay, can anyone tell me why this has happened? Why in the most modern models there is no equation of money supply? That is the money market clearing, and you are arriving at a money supply or money demand equation with an equilibrium yielding the LM curve. This animal does not exist in any of the modern models. No? It existed in the older models. Why does it?
Sir, is it because?
Don't ask me. I have asked you the question.
Okay. As I understand it, it should be because money supply is a nominal variable, and now we are more concerned with the real aspects of the economy. And like when we are determining the long-term unemployment and output numbers, it really doesn't matter.
No. But we are talking about short-run policy, Baba.
Money supply is a constant managed by central bank. So there is no. I mean, money supply is fixed by the central bank. I mean, central bank can increase or decrease the money supply as per the money demand to keep money market in equilibrium.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, money demand is a function of interest rate and income. So to equilibrate money market, you have to.
I understand all that. But in the modern macroeconomics that you study, there is no LM curve, no?
Sir, because there is an inflation targeting.
Forget inflation targeting. Just remember any standard 2 or 3 equation model that you have studied. There is an IS curve. Correct? And then there will be an equation relating to the rate of interest. Correct? And then depending on what kind of a labor market, this, that, and that, you will have a few more equations. And what is going to determine how is the interest rate equation written? Do you have a monetary aggregate in the model? The answer is no, right? Whatever model you are thinking of. Think of the more recent models that you have studied. Some neo-Keynesian type model. The money, capital M as money supply does not enter those models. Agreed or not? You don't agree? Nobody?
Sir,
Okay.
because changing interest rate is actually to change the money supply. I mean, if
Yes,
you
I
decrease
agree.
the interest rate, money supply increases. So I don't know why we are completely neglecting money supply. I mean, I may be wrong,
No,
but I'm
you
not
don't know. That is fine.
understanding.
But do you agree that there is no monetary aggregate in our equation specifications of reasonably modern macro models? Listen to my statement carefully. We do not have a monetary aggregate in our equations. That much is correct, no? We have interest rate, but that is determined by something else. There is no monetary aggregate. Correct?
So by monetary aggregate, we mean the money supply, right?
That's right. What else can it be?
Yes, sir.
Nahi hai na? You must have, I mean, in macro 2, you would have done these models here without the
Yes,
money
sir.
supply. Yeah? So there is
Yes,
no
sir.
money supply. Why is that? Think about it. So in your undergraduation, you do ISLM, blah, blah, blah. And you come to your post graduation and suddenly there is no LM curve at all. It never struck you as to why this is happening. Okay. So good, let this question boil over a little bit. We will have occasion to come back to it. When we come back to it, we'll discuss it. In that time being, think about it. Okay, so keeping interest rates predictable is one thing. Okay. And don't tinker around too much with the taxes. Why? See, we said that the political consensus must give me a G to Y ratio, correct? Which the country generally agrees on. Now, as soon as a G to Y ratio is thrown up by the political process, a tax revenue to Y ratio is also thrown up, right? So if I say that my G to Y ratio is 25%, then in an ideal situation, my tax revenue to Y ratio must also be 25% or thereabouts. I mean, you cannot say that I want to have a G to Y ratio of 25% with a tax to GDP ratio of 10%. That just does not make sense, right? Okay, so if the political process is giving us a G to Y ratio, it implicitly is also giving us a permanent TR to Y ratio. Okay. Now, so there will be some permanent tax ratio that you have. Okay. Now, if you think about your IS curve, if your tax rates and everything is stable, then you fix the IS curve, right? Okay. Set the IS curve at the long run normal level, depending on the long run desired G. Correct? So if I have a long run desired G, that immediately implies a long run desired tax revenue to GDP ratio. Hopefully, those are very, very close by. Okay. Actually, in the strictest sense of the word, they must be the same. Okay. And then use small changes in G for short run fine tuning, stabilization policy, as the results are most certain. Okay. So huge experience of stabilization has shown people that small doses of an increase or decrease in expenditures works well. Okay, because if you make tax changes, we don't know how the consumers are going to respond to that, right? It will all depend whether they believe that the tax changes are permanent or they are temporary. If they believe they are temporary, what will happen? So if I change the tax rates as stabilization policy, but the consumers believe that they are temporary, will anything happen?
Sir, the consumption will not change that much.
That's
They'll
right. So
maintain the
then
level of
those
consumption.
multipliers will be highly questionable, right? You cannot arrive at multipliers over which you will have any confidence, right? Okay, so in the literature, there seems to be a consensus that the best way to run stabilization policy is to make interest rates predictable. Now, think about it. You know, if you are in an inflation targeting regime, that makes interest rates very, very predictable, isn't it? Because if the central government announces this 4% or 6% is my target, okay, and if inflation goes above that target, you know what is going to happen to interest rates. So one of the most important things that a inflation targeting regime does is to make interest rates predictable. And once interest rates are predictable, that helps business, consumer, everybody's decision making. Okay. And then if your political consensus has given you a G to Y ratio and an implied tax revenue to Y ratio, then if actual output is higher than potential output, then decrease G a little bit. If actual output is much less than potential output, then increase G a little bit. So this is the kind of stabilization story that standard macroeconomics gives us. Do you agree with this way of putting things? Okay. Or you think that this is not a good summary of what is good stabilization? Agreed?
Yes, sir.
All right. So let's keep this at the back of our mind. Okay. Now, we now take a very brief look at what the neoclassical approach has to say about stabilization. Okay. The neoclassical views are based on rational expectations hypotheses and the relative unimportance of government policies for changes in the real variables. So, the theory of rational expectations argues that people will use all available information relating to the process determining a variable when forming their forecast or expenditure of that variable. Okay. Thus, it is assumed that expectations are formed on the basis of all available information relating to the true process governing the behavior of the variable. So this is our standard rational expectation story. This is viewed by many economists as a natural extension of the usual postulate in economic theory that unless there is good empirical evidence to the contrary, one should presume that agents will always strive to bring their expectations into consistency with their information. So you have studied about rational expectations, right? So this is just a revision. Okay, you've studied rational expectations, right? In your macro 1. Right?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, okay. So when government expenditure declines, individuals expect a reduction in future taxes that increases their lifetime income and present consumption. So if I have a rational expectations framework, there is nothing that a government can do to influence real variables. Okay? If the assumptions about markets having no imperfections, blah, 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 are all retained, then in that ideal world, government expenditure increase or decrease is useless. Agreed? To make government expenditure potent, I will have to introduce a imperfection somewhere. Standardly, this is done in labor markets. Okay, and if I have wage rigidities, then even in a rational expectations framework, you will have a role for the government such that if the government increases G, a real variable will move. Okay, so whether the government action actually can move real variables is contingent on there being some imperfection somewhere in the model that we specify. Agreed? In a model with the standard neoclassical assumptions about markets, there is nothing to stabilize. Why? Because anything that the government does cannot move any real variable. Okay. Now, this takes us to our standard Ricardian equivalence theorem. If a government reduces tax rates and issues debt to finance deficit, the individual's knowledge that government is fiscally constrained would lead them to expect future tax rate increases. So there is nothing, because there is full information, right? Okay. There is nothing that the government can do which hides any information from anybody. So willy-nilly, all government action is futile because it does not move a real variable at all in this kind of a framework. Okay, and that would reduce their wealth through their permanent income, though they would be unaffected. It would also review them to review their lifetime consumption, increase saving for future consumption, and reduce present consumption. So this is just to explain as to why, consequently, tax cuts will not typically increase consumption. So on the contrary, a reduction in government expenditure will lead individuals to expect a decline in taxes in the future. That will increase their present consumption. So according to the Ricardian equivalence theorem, only the quantity of government expenditure, not its modes of financing that expenditure between taxes and government borrowings, affects real variables in the economy. Hence, taxes and bond financing have an equivalent effect on the economy. If the Ricardian equivalence theorem does in fact hold, then there would be no rationale for government to issue bonds. Okay. However, there is a second order effect of the social welfare costs of taxation over time, because doing without taxes is entirely impossible. The problem for policymakers is how to finance indispensable government expenditure while keeping the welfare cost low. Now, see from where the neoclassical economists are coming. See, these are people who are going to argue that we should have a small G to Y ratio. Why? Because if the government has to spend, it has to tax. If it taxes, it imposes welfare costs. This we learn from our microeconomics, right? So a neoclassical economist or a person with a leaning towards the right would always argue that the list of items on which the government should spend money should be small. Defense, police, etc., etc. So this list of items will be small. Okay, why will it be small? Because if you will have to tax to fund this. If you are going to tax, then that tax has a welfare cost. Okay, so you should take your government expenditure as far as the gains from government expenditure exactly balance the welfare costs of taxation, and this is going to lead to a small G to Y ratio. Do you see the point being, what is the thinking of the right-wing people when it comes to this? Okay. The Keynesians, of course, will have a slightly different view, but this is where the rational expectations, neoclassical people are coming from. Okay, any questions before we go ahead? Okay. However, the society would benefit if taxes are imposed in a way that minimizes the welfare costs of taxation. So that's fine. Now, one rationale for removing fiscal imbalances is to minimize the vested loss of non-lump sum taxes, those which distort the structure of incentives by spreading the burden of taxes over time. Okay. Now, according to Barrow's tax smoothing hypothesis, since taxes distort individual choices, and since those distortions rise more than proportionately with the tax rate, steady and moderate tax rates are preferable to alternating periods of high and low tax rates over the business cycle. So now, this is a very, very important thing, okay? That don't tinker with taxes. Okay, and though not everybody agrees with this, don't tinker with taxes, but this is something that has a very dominant effect. That is, you should get your tax system right. Once it is right, don't tinker with it. Of course, this lesson has not been learned by many undeveloped countries, including ours. Okay, we are forever confused as to what should. So the epitome of this confusion was our ex-finance minister, may his soul rest in peace, Mr. Jaitley. So if anybody had heard Mr. Jaitley talk about taxes and anybody had studied any economics, he would get heart attacks. Because he was an epitome of the political confusion on what view we should take on taxes. So income taxes are direct taxes, which are very good, but we are a poor country. We will not tax agriculture. Okay. Indirect taxes we know are very bad. Not only are they regressive, okay, but the price signals because of contamination of indirect taxes also causes a lot of confusion. But we are an undeveloped country, so it is inevitable for us to have a large amount of indirect taxation. So, these kinds of arguments just show a complete lack of appreciation of the need to have a tax policy over which there is a general consensus and whose distorting effects are not overwhelming. Okay, so by any stretch of imagination, the taxation world that we live in India is hugely suboptimal. Okay, and this is something that we should keep in mind. So an implication of this is that for a given path of government spending, tax rate should be held constant over the business cycle. And the budget surplus should move in a pro-cyclical manner. Think about this. So if you are going to fix your tax rates and not tinker with them, and in a boom, you are going to get more taxes but cut back on expenditures. Okay, then the budget surplus should move in a pro-cyclical manner. Agreed? So in a boom, you should have a budget surplus. In a recession, you should have a deficit. Okay? And this is coming basically from Barrow's tax smoothing story. Okay. Any questions on this? Because this is just a background that we should never forget. Okay, we should always have this at the back of our minds. Okay. Now, so that was the neoclassical story, and now let's come to these three papers which I have kept in the files. Okay, and see all this theory that we have done. Okay, in your macro 1, macro 2, and some that even I have talked about. Does that help actual policymakers? Okay. Now, So if you look at the financial crisis, okay, a substantial part of policy innovation during the financial crisis was focused on monetary policy. And this is not surprising, because one great advantage of monetary policy is that it can be implemented very quickly. So if the central bank gets up in the morning feeling that the interest rate should rise or fall, they have the policy instruments to actually go and do that. While on fiscal policy, such thing is not possible, because government budgets have to go through a parliamentary process. Though there are, what shall we say, ways in which a government can increase expenditures if they so desire, but the speed with which they will be able to do it is much, much slower, substantially slower than the reaction time that is available to central bankers. Okay, so this is a distinction between the two policy instruments that should never be forgotten. A government expenditure has to go through a parliamentary process, okay, with a huge amount of oversight. Now, decisions of the central bank also has a lot of oversight, but the process of decision making can be hugely accelerated. Okay, now, okay, so this was mainly because the monetary authority were able to move quickly. Now, decisions with respect to fiscal policy are slower in both the decision making process and the implementation. So this was the point that one was trying to make. Now, obviously, given the severity of the financial crisis, both tools were needed. But notice that the discussion was clearly on the side of monetary policy, sheerly because of the speed with which that could be done. Now, the most difficult question that policymakers are unable to deal with in many underdeveloped countries is the following. How much headroom should a country maintain in its debt to GDP ratio in a pre-recession or boom period? Okay, now, headroom meaning how much ability should the government have, okay, to increase its borrowing or increase its expenditure or decrease it. Now, think about it like this. We already had a very large fiscal deficit. And because you have a large fiscal deficit, this reduces the headroom for you to increase government expenditures without triggering large inflation episodes, because you are starting from a point of a high deficit. Okay, so how do you provide governments with headroom? Okay, if you have no headroom, you cannot move. Okay, so if a crisis or a recession hits you, and you already have a large deficit, you have no headroom, and then you cannot do anything without triggering a large inflation. Okay, this is a standard conundrum of all underdeveloped countries and some developed countries as well, as we know what happened in Greece and Portugal and some other country. So the crisis taught us that while governments cut taxes, increased spending, and ran deficits during cyclical booms, possibly out of political expedience, they used the borrowing capacity that was needed later when the crisis eventually hit. Now, this person argues that because of bad behavior in booms, where governments just did not save, when the crisis hit, They had no headroom. Okay, and remember, we have said that in underdeveloped countries, it is standardly to have pro-cyclical fiscal policy. It is true of some much fewer advanced countries as well. So this is where this person is coming from. Okay, if there is bad behavior, if there is pro-cyclical fiscal policy, then when a recession comes to you because of some external shock, you have no headroom to do anything. Okay, and this is something that we will discuss in some detail as we go on. In a recession, when there is a need to have higher deficits, resulting in a need to tap debt markets. Okay, now this task is easier and cheaper when the debt to GDP ratio inherited from boom times is relatively low. So, when a government is in a boom time, it must reduce the debt to GDP ratio. That is, it must, in the best of circumstances, run a surplus budget. Okay, okay. Of course, in India, have we ever run a surplus budget? Does anybody know? Can anybody remember a surplus budget?
No, sir. I don't think so.
Even when you start looking at it from the 1950s onwards?
No, and in 1947, there was a political will to move the budget to surplus, but it was never achieved.
So we have always had a budget deficit. No? So what is the kind of fiscal leeway that we had? Very little, right? Okay, okay. So now, on the other hand, you can think about the US. Some presidents promised a surplus and delivered it. No? Okay. So this leads to the question of how much borrowing capacity should a country build up outside downturns. Okay, now for a policy maker, this becomes a question of great importance. Because notice, if something prevents you from building up borrowing capacity when the going is good, your ability to spend when the going is bad is compromised. So politicians understand this, bureaucrats understand this, economics can build sophisticated models basically showing you how this story works. Okay, okay, but on the ground, this lesson is never learned. Ever. In our country, it has never been learned. Okay, and therefore we are always in the realm of what is known as of course financial repression, because you need to have a large fiscal deficit, but what the term is called fiscal dominance. Okay, now this fiscal dominance can arise because of many things. That is, there is a political consensus on G, but we as a society are never able to figure out a good way to finance that G. So we give some lame arguments like we are an undeveloped country. In poor countries, you cannot have direct taxes to have a lot of importance. So we will depend on indirect taxes, irrespective of their distortionary effects, etc., etc., etc. And because of bad thinking, bad policies, no clear understanding of how to bring the tax rates, the tax revenues close to the G that you want. Okay, and in this inability to match the G and tax revenue, society ends up always borrowing from the future generations. Okay, so this continuous deficit that you are seeing means what? Means I am just assuming that, growth rates later are going to be great. So I'm going to retire in a few years now. You are going to go up in your career in less than 6 months time. So you are going to start paying taxes. So that's great. Okay. It is your generation that will deal with this. Our generation has been irresponsible. So that's it. Live with it. Okay. Because children cannot vote, we can always do this. Okay. Because if a child could vote and he would see that this irresponsible elder generation is always, borrowing on the basis of what we are going to repay in terms of taxes, this is highly irresponsible. Okay, but nobody wants to posit the question in this way. Okay, so they will give you some lame, stupid arguments as to why we should be in a permanent state of budget deficit. That is continuously shift the burden to the future generations. I think both the economists, the politics, it just does not add up. Why this happens is,
Sir, isn't this just a direct outcome of how our electoral politics functions? Because the government is going to change every 5 years. So you want to make people happy and win the next election. So you spend a lot, even if there is a boom.
hold on this thought. We will be developing this thought formally in a econometric model. Okay, I think the cyclical ratcheting paper is up. No, I have put it up. I don't remember now whether I think I have put it up. If I have not, I will do it. But hold this thought. We are going to develop this thought as we go along. Okay, and build a formal model to test this, whether what you are saying is true. But we are not going to go by electoral cycles, because going by electoral cycles takes us in a slightly different way. Okay, but we are going to talk about the politics of it and try and model it. Okay, but not in terms of electoral cycles, because that's a different literature, which is relevant but not so germane to our discussions just now. Okay, so we are only raising these questions which operationally do not have answers as of now.
So just one counter that last point you told, borrowing at the cost of credibility of future generations.
Not credibility, making them pay, right?
Okay, yes. So so there was a counter argument to this. If future generation is going to be richer than the present generation, so what is the problem in increasing the present consumption if growth in future is
Suppose it is not so.
I mean,
do you really want to play this gamble? I mean, come on. For how long did we have a Hindu rate of growth? Consider your entire 1950, from 1947 to 1991. What was the rate of growth that was achieved? Even after 1991, how many really high growth years have you had? How many can you count? 5, 6?
But on average, we have grown around 5% or something.
Listen to the question very carefully. How many high growth years have you had?
Around 6 to 7.
That's right. 6. Let us agree on 6. How many years for which have we been independent?
More than
47 to 2021. Now 26 January, right? Well over 72 years now, no? 73, whatever that is. So a society that has experienced 7 years of high growth rates is now trying to argue, I don't know. I mean, for me, this is an atrocious argument. Your history does not, what shall I say, Any econometrician who looks at the data is not going to believe you. No? If you are saying that we should build castles in the air, that's a different matter. Okay. Now, what happens if we grow at 3%, 4%, or 5% for the next 10 years? While all your calculations are being made on size of G and expenditure and tax and all that, at that we will go at 8% for the next 5 years. This does not make sense. No, this is borderline stupid, right? Why borderline? Completely stupid. Sound economic management of an economy cannot fall prey to such rubbish. Okay. We need to do things in a much more realistic way. Okay. And there is no way a permanent budget deficit can be justified by any economics. It just cannot happen. Okay. An economist cannot take the argument seriously when history has no such episodes. If the Chinese make this argument, it is credible, right? So for how many years did they have 10% growth? 15 odd years. No?
Yeah.
So if the Chinese make this argument, but actually the Chinese try to reduce the G2Y ratio. No? So, one difficulty with talking about the Chinese is that their data, especially when it comes to government expenditures, is supposedly very, very suspect. So, thinking about stabilization policy in China is very tough. Okay, but think about South Korea. Okay, think about the Asian tigers. They experienced high growth rates for a very long time. No? So South Korea became a developed country over a period of 15-20 years, right? So for that society to talk the way you are talking has some credibility. For the Indian society to make such arguments has absolutely no credibility at all. When you just plot the data and see it. Unless you are saying that, I'm going to now talk to an astrologer, then of course anything is justifiable. But as long as you are going to try and justify your arguments with data, I don't think this argument can be made at all. Okay. All right. Now, the next question that is very important, and let me tell you that there is a large literature on this as well, that all the fiscal multipliers that we talk about, can we estimate them? There are estimates available, of course. There's a very nice paper in the Brookings some years back detailing methods by which these fiscal multipliers can be estimated. One is an econometric estimate, of course, so that's standard. The other is estimates that come out of computable general equilibrium models, which my good friend Ganesh is teaching you nowadays, Professor Ganesh Kumar. Okay, so you will get an idea as to how to arrive at numbers with respect to fiscal multipliers via econometric models and via computable general equilibrium models. Okay, now research shows that fiscal multipliers can be much larger when monetary policy reaches the zero lower bound. Okay, so at very low interest rates, fiscal multipliers are large. So remember the multiplier formulae that you must have studied in your undergraduation. And all those formulas will tell you that at low interest rates, you will have large multipliers. So that basic economics has been, what shall we say, reinforced by empirics in this sense. Okay. All right. Moreover, excess capacity or output gaps in the economy increase fiscal multipliers. This is our standard Keynesian story. Now, having fiscally responded to recessions, policymakers may need to move towards fiscal consolidation, that is, reduction of deficits, when an economy is still weak, either in the aftermath of the crisis or worse, during a crisis itself associated with fiscal imbalance. Now, what happens, that now our current government is saying that we are going to increase the fiscal deficit even further because of the pandemic. Leave aside the question whether fiscal policy can at all deal with this shock. Okay. Suppose we don't get into that question and say, okay, increase the. But at some point, you will have to have a plan where you are going to get out of this deficit. No? You will have to move towards fiscal consolidation, because if you don't, you will trigger inflation episodes. So, working through fiscal consolidation is very, very difficult. Remember, Chidambaram just, one way of working towards fiscal consolidation is to have fiscal rules or have fiscal responsibility bills, etc., etc. But when you have irresponsible finance ministers who will tear up the fiscal responsibility bill and throw it into the waste paper basket, then nothing actually works. No. So this is a problem that is very, very serious. Once you have expanded government expenditures in a recession, then you need to move to fiscal consolidation, and this is very, very difficult. Okay. Now, policymakers face the essential conundrum that financial markets are looking for credible improvements in the structural fiscal stance at the same time that the economy will suffer the most from fiscal tightening, right? So on the financial side, all the rating agencies are looking very closely at your fiscal balance. Why are they looking very closely at your fiscal balance? Because they know that the pressures of inflation are going to arise. If inflation arises, interest rates go up. If interest rates go up, we know what happens to the valuations. Okay, so how is this to be managed? So you will have many finance ministers saying that we don't care about the Moody's and all that, we don't care about them. We will do what is good for the economy, whatever such statements mean. Okay, the financial market should not kind of tell us what we should do on the fiscal side. All kinds of crazy statements are made by politicians and economists who don't really figure out that borrowing from the next generations, when there is high uncertainty about the kind of growth rates that you can expect, okay, is bad policy, period. Okay, so the basic point is, if you cannot agree on a G to Y ratio and an implied tax revenue to Y ratio, you are in deep trouble. You are not going to be able to manage your economy properly. The one reason why underdeveloped countries have macro difficulties is that their politics throws up one G to Y ratio, okay, but they do not have the ability to raise taxes to reach that G to Y ratio, and then all hell breaks loose. Okay, this is the story of India since 1947 to 1991. Okay, that the planners wanted a very high G to Y ratio without raising taxes. So that turned out to be completely not feasible. So then you have to move away from that. Now, again, we are moving towards a same kind of story, that the politics is not throwing us, taking us to a lower G2I ratio. Everybody wants to have a high G2I ratio, but nobody wants to do anything on the taxation side. Or whatever you do on the taxation side is not good enough. Okay, so we are going to suffer this for the foreseeable future, actually. Now, so the one question that is normally asked in this context is fiscal rules the answer? So, such rules can allow for deficit spending when the economy is weakest, with a credible commitment to fiscal sustainability as the economy improves. So, in the Indian case, the Fiscal Responsibility Act has no credibility at all. So, this fiscal rules, can they be the answer? We will have a lot to say as we go along, but just to flag it, that in the Indian case, it is a non-starter. Rules can also help impose discipline during good times to rebuild debt capacity and bring down the debt GDP ratio after a downturn. This is wishful thinking. It is like, telling a drunkard not to drink and drive. Okay, so or telling Indians that, don't look at your mobile phone when you drive. We know that it is not going to happen, right? So Indians will always look at their mobile phones when they drive. Even if it leads to a large number of deaths on the highway, well, we are so confident that nothing happened to us that it's okay to, so this is the kind of thing so you can have all the rules, but they will have no credibility. So fiscal rules have well-known problems because they are rigid by design and difficult to customize to particular circumstances. Now, suppose you had fiscal rules, this, that, and the other, and suddenly the pandemic struck. Should fiscal rules be taken seriously in a pandemic? How is one to answer this question? So this is the problem with fiscal rules. Okay. Now, once the downturn has eased, how rapid should fiscal consolidation be during a recovery, if there is a recovery? A crisis can have a long-term effect on the macroeconomy by reducing potential output. Now, in the current context of the pandemic, this is something that is being taken very seriously. But this is not a problem that a stabilization policy can address. Okay. How exactly would this happen is not particularly well understood. Okay. The long-term sustainability of public finances is crucial if fiscal policy is to play a larger role in stabilizing the economy. Now, what does this mean? It basically means that once society has decided on a G to Y ratio, it must have the ability to have a tax revenue to Y ratio that is consistent with that G to Y ratio. If there remains a very large gap between the G to Y ratio that you aspire to and the tax revenue to Y ratio that you can actually deliver, this is a road to disaster. Okay, we will do a small formal empirical model to show how this works, but that's coming later. Okay, now I think today we can stop here, because I don't want to start the Buchanan and Wagner story and leave it halfway. Okay. Okay, any questions?
Yes, sir. I have a question. So, sir, you said pre-1991, the tax revenues were not sufficient to keep up with the government expenditure, right?
No, wait a minute. Wait a minute. Let's have this. That is, we as a society aspire to a much larger G2Y ratio than what our ability to tax, our ability to deliver a tax revenue to Y ratio was very far away from our aspiration of the G2Y ratio. That is the correct statement. Okay. Now go ahead.
Okay, sir. So, because what I was thinking was that during the 50s and 60s, we had very high tax rates where our income tax rates even went up to 95% in the top slab.
Right.
So we were clearly taxing very high, and so to say, there were many tax slabs which were quite irrational from a micro taxation perspective.
Really?
So,
I thought progressive income taxation from a macroeconomic perspective is highly appreciated. Macroeconomists want progressive taxes.
yeah, I said micro, that's why. So there were 15 to 16 tax slabs, and that really confused people in that way. That's the argument that's typically given. Like, it was difficult to file taxes with so many slabs, and the evasion was high, and the complication increased a lot. So yeah.
No, but these
But
are
we
only
were
sob
taxing
stories.
heavily.
No, hey, come on. These are only sob stories. If you as a society aspire to a particular G, okay, how can you not be committed to a tax revenue that is close to that G? I mean, what is the thinking that is going on which makes you aspire to a particular G without really bothering about the tax revenue to Y ratio? So, according to me, this borderline case of craziness. I mean, complete.
Okay, sir.
There is just no rationale. So everybody wants a very good G by Y ratio, whatever it is, 10%, 5%, 20%, 30%. Society, through a political process, comes to some kind of a consensus. But that is the easy consensus. The more difficult consensus is how the hell are you going to finance that? Then some people come and tell you, there is no need to finance it. So what you do is you make your later generations pay, abhi deficit lagao. This is the kind of economic logic that has been pushed operationally, not intellectually. Operationally, this is the kind of logic that has been pushed. Okay, now this has completely compromised your macroprudentials, your ability to run sane macroeconomic policies. So along comes Narasimha Rao, who sees that this is a problem and tries to correct it. But then, things don't pan out exactly as planned after 1991. You had 6 or 7 years of very high growth. And after that, it's not really anything to write home about. Okay. And the future also now does not look very good because of the pandemic, right? So one should be very, very worried about this irresponsible government. If it increases G, then it is condemning us to a high inflation, which will, it has always happened that if you increase G, like Chidambaram increased G in a very irresponsible way, they had to deal with high inflation. And the Subbarao Chidambaram story, we all know, how it panned out. There is no reason to think that anything else will happen now. You may have a very friendly governor or what, I don't know. But how are you not going to have an inflation? That is an inevitable thing. So we have never been in a situation where sane macro policies could be argued about and could be followed. Okay, everything in macroeconomic policies in our country, as I see it, has been jugaad. Okay. Okay. So,
Sir, Sir, I have two questions regarding fiscal rules. Fiscal rules, I mean, as you said, that look inconsistent because there is a valid principal agent problem here. Principal is also the government, agent is also the government. So the point is, how does it actually work in principle? And the second question is, when you say that crisis you can have exceptions to fiscal rules, which actually makes sense. In pandemic, you can't show FRBM app to the governor, to the finance minister. So when you say that in crisis you can have exceptions to fiscal rules, and in recovery you should come back to them. So this is the entire work of Jugaad only. So how do you? I mean, how does this work in principle, or do institutions matter, or
okay,
do?
we will discuss this in some detail as we go along. Okay, this is exactly what we are going to talk about. Okay. So let me say this, that we are going to study a very successful case of fiscal stabilization of Chile, which of course that story has completely fallen apart recently. Okay, Chile has gone back into chaos now, right? But for around 15 odd years, 20 odd years, it had become the role model kind of a country for moving from fiscal chaos to a very scientific and responsible fiscal running of the country. I mean, the fiscal policies of Chile. So we will discuss this as to this will be a country study that we will do. So we will talk about this, how Chile achieved it. I was extremely disappointed because I was very excited when I read about the Chile episode and all that. And Chile now back is back in chaos. Okay, so of course, this is a special problem of single commodity countries. Chile is a copper producer, right? So we will talk about this in some detail as we go along. Let me not give the story up front, otherwise there is nothing left, right? So okay, anything else? Oh, excuse me. Sorry. Okay, so I will meet you on Wednesday. Please keep your.
Sir, not relating to the subject matter, but first thing, will you be uploading the slides that you are like
With some
teaching?
lag, yes. Because
Okay,
I
sir.
want you, incentivize you to read the papers. If I upload the slides, very few people bother to read the papers, and that is not on.
Okay, sir.
Okay.
And and I just wanted to ask if Dr. Ajeshwari will be taking a session or a class to give a brief about her subject.
Let me see. I will now. Those of you who have opted for my course will have to take her course. She's very busy with her undergraduate teaching just now. She missed some classes, so she had to do a lot of makeup and all that. And they have 3 classes a week, right?
Yes, sir.
Because their semester is shortened. So just now it is becoming very difficult, but let me talk to her and confirm this. Okay. Yeah.
Okay, sir. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Bye.
Sir, what will be the evaluation pattern, if you can?
One quiz will be there and one midterm exam will be there. So I have to evaluate you for 50 marks, right? This is a half credit course. So 10 marks I will give you a quiz and 40 marks I will give you a midterm exam. Okay.
Okay, so quiz will be a written quiz or a oral quiz, like you'll be asking?
Written. Baba, oral, no, written quiz.
Okay, sir.